Medieval European diets were bizarre. Rich folks dined on stuffed porpoise stomachs and blood custard, while the poor settled for pickled carrots, with ale for everyone. Medieval banquets were often lavish displays of wealth and status, where hosts went all out to impress their guests. Rare and extravagant dishes were a staple, with exotic sea creatures often featured as centerpieces. Seals, porpoises, and even whales graced the tables, showing off the host's opulence. These grand feasts were not only about indulgence, but also about showcasing the host's power and taste, with such rare ingredients signaling a level of sophistication and luxury at these extravagant gatherings.
This is fine feasting, is it not, Sir Rodney? Indeed, Old Waldron.
While medieval feasts were all about extravagant presentation, the actual taste might not meet today's standards. Take porpoises, for instance. One preparation involved porpoise pudding, essentially a stuffed porpoise stomach, similar to Scottish haggis, but with a sea creature twist. The porpoise wasn't the main flavor. It mostly served as a casing for the other ingredients. Despite its unusual preparation, medieval diners seemed to enjoy it, showcasing how the spectacle of food could sometimes take precedence over taste in those opulent banquets. You might think brightly colored candies are a modern invention, but medieval banquets were full of vibrant foods, particularly custards. A popular dessert for the wealthy, custard was made from dairy and eggs, ingredients easily accessible to medieval cooks. Though custard is a broad term, it was commonly seen as a sweet dish in the Middle Ages, just as it is today. However, unlike modern meals, medieval feasts didn't have a separate dessert course. Instead, sweet dishes like custard were served throughout the meal, alongside the savory courses, offering a delightful balance of flavors, as noted by Bucknell University.
Oh, yes. At supper time, she would go straight for honey cakes, candied almonds, custard, anything sweet.
Today, we rely on synthetic food coloring to create vibrant dishes, but medieval chefs turned to nature for similar results. To achieve bright hues in their custards, they used ingredients like sandalwood for red, boiled blood for black, and saffron for yellow, as noted by the British Library. The role of spices in medieval cuisine is a mix of fact and fiction, and while the truth is fascinating, the myths can be even more entertaining. One persistent myth claims spices were used to mask the taste of rotten meat due to the lack of refrigeration. However, this theory doesn't hold up for a couple of reasons. First, medieval people preserved meat through drying and salting, not by relying on spices. Second, spices were expensive and considered luxurious, so it's highly unlikely they'd be wasted on spoiled food, and the poor had little to no access to them. In reality, most spices were imported from Asia and Africa, making them rare and a symbol of wealth and status for the nobility. Black pepper, for example, was as valuable as gold during the medieval period. Sugar, now common and inexpensive, was also rare and treated as a luxury spice. This may explain why sweet and savory dishes were often served together at banquets, as sugar was still considered a spice. That said, some spices were grown in Europe, such as mustard, which were more accessible and available even to peasants, who cultivated them alongside herbs like dill and mint. Back to that colorful custard we discussed earlier, made mostly from dairy. Well, dairy wasn't just reserved for the rich in the Middle Ages. While custards were a luxury for the wealthy, dairy products were readily available to the poor. In fact, the British Library notes that many medieval peasants kept dairy cows, so cheese, buttermilk, curds, and whey were common parts of their daily diets. The ruling classes enjoyed fancier dairy dishes like almond milk pies and cheese tarts, but cheese was more widely consumed by people of all social standings. Interestingly, though milk was a part of medieval life, it wasn't as commonly drunk by adults. As Medieval Times points out, milk was generally considered a drink for children. It may not have been the go-to dairy product for adults, who likely preferred cheese and other dairy goods instead. In the Middle Ages, one dish that was universally enjoyed across Europe was pottage, a hearty stew that everyone, regardless of class, could rely on. However, like many foods of the time, pottage varied widely depending on social standing. At its core, pottage was a simple mixture of ingredients simmered in stock, often thickened with grains. The real difference between the versions enjoyed by the rich and the poor lay in the ingredients added to the base. For peasants, pottage was typically made from oats, with whatever vegetables they could grow in their small garden patches. Leeks were a common addition, but in times of scarcity, the dish might include more basic ingredients like peas and beans. The rule was simple: if you could grow it, it went into the pottage. On the other hand, wealthier classes enjoyed a more luxurious version of pottage. Their stews featured a greater variety of vegetables and often included substantial amounts of meat, making their meals much more filling and flavorful. A true feast compared to the simpler fare of the lower classes.
You take this home, throw it in a pot, add some broth, a potato. Baby, you got a stew going.
We've long known that fruits and vegetables are packed with nutrients that benefit our health, and while modern-day parents still encourage their kids to eat them, it turns out the medieval folks weren't so different. Recipes from the Middle Ages often featured fruits and vegetables in a variety of dishes, including fried beans, pea porridge, apple bread pudding, and cherry pudding. These meals suggest that medieval diners understood the value of produce, whether for health benefits or simply because it was easy to grow. However, their approach to eating these foods differs significantly from ours today. While modern raw food enthusiasts argue that cooking vegetables and fruits depletes their nutrients, medieval eaters took the opposite view. They not only preferred their produce cooked, but they believed that eating raw fruits and vegetables could be harmful. According to the British Library, some medieval texts even warned against consuming raw produce, claiming it could lead to various health issues. Beware of green salads and raw fruits, for they will make your master sick. Given the potential dangers of eating raw foods and the likelihood that food wasn't washed as thoroughly as today, cooking everything was probably the safer choice in the Middle Ages. So, it's understandable they took that precaution without harsh judgment. Bread has been a staple in almost every culture throughout history, and medieval Britain was no exception. During this time, bread and other grain-based foods made up the majority of the diet, with some estimates suggesting they provided up to 75% of the calories consumed. Interestingly, people in the Middle Ages sometimes used scooped-out bread loaves as makeshift plates, much like today's bread bowls used for soups. However, not all bread was equal. Its quality varied depending on one's social status, and the wealthier class enjoyed superior bread made from fine grains, while the poor often had to settle for coarser varieties. The most prized and expensive bread was white bread, made from wheat, which was difficult for peasants to produce. In contrast, the lower classes commonly baked bread from rye or barley, and when grains were scarce, they often used peas, beans, or even acorns as substitutes. Interestingly, while we tend to prefer whole grains and darker breads today, the medieval elite would have favored white bread, highlighting a significant shift in bread preferences over the centuries. Fish might seem like a basic food, but it played a more important role than you'd expect. While many hearty dishes were reserved for the medieval elite, those living by the sea had easy access to fish. This set them apart from the inland poor, who often had little to no access to fish or meat in their diets.
And the Lord did grin, and the people did feast upon the lambs and sloths and carp and anchovies and orangutans and breakfast cereals and fruit bats and large...
Skip a bit, brother.
Living near the sea gave medieval people access to a wide variety of fish, including cod, herring, eel, and even whale, though technically not a fish. But let's overlook that. Freshwater fish, like dace and grayling, were also available to those near rivers or lakes. However, access to certain fish was more restricted by social class. As the history learning site notes, common villagers could fish in rivers for smaller species, but prized fish like salmon and trout were reserved for the local lord. Lords often stocked private ponds, and anyone caught fishing for these exclusive catches faced severe penalties.
Dost have thou a mug of ale for me and me mate?
He has been pitched in battle for a fortnight,
And has a king's thirst for the frosty brews.
While some sources suggest beer was a common beverage in the Middle Ages, ale was actually the drink of choice for most people across different social classes. Beer, as we know it, was brewed with hops, whereas ale was made without them, often flavored with herbs or spices instead. Medieval peasants typically consumed simple and affordable food and drink, but ale was an exception. Brewing ale was a labor-intensive process that took several days and required careful attention. Unlike most other foods, ale wasn't easily made, making it a more involved and costly drink to produce. Still, it was widely consumed throughout medieval society by both the wealthy and the poor, with every meal, sometimes even at breakfast. Ale became a staple beverage in medieval villages, reflecting its significant role in daily life during this period. It wasn't just a luxury, it was an essential part of the diet for many, despite its complex production process. Pickled foods were common in the Middle Ages and enjoyed by people of all classes, including the nobility. However, fresh ingredients were still considered more desirable, so the wealthy typically preferred fresh produce when possible, leaving pickled options more for the peasants. Despite this, pickling remained a popular way to preserve food for everyone.
We can pickle that!
In the Middle Ages, pickling served the same purpose as it does today, preserving food for longer shelf life. Foods like fish, Vegetables and eggs were submerged in acidic brine, often made with vinegar or lemon juice. This method was especially useful for the poor, enabling them to enjoy essential foods year-round. Commonly pickled items included herring and fruits, while bacon was more often salted. Pigs, being inexpensive to raise and low maintenance, provided a reliable source of meat even for the lower classes, making pork more accessible than other meats.
The salted pork is particularly good.
Salted pork.